The human space miners fought with the batshit crazy bravery of rabid dogs, rushing towards the swarm of alien craft with mining lasers blazing. George Powell gripped the Stargazer's controls with white knuckles, his jaw tightening as he pushed the ship's engines beyond their limits. Flashes of blinding light reflected off his weathered face as the alien fighters vaporized ship after ship, the unfortunate vessels vanishing in bursts of flame and debris. George had seen some shit in his long career as a deep space miner, but nothing like this. He'd spent the last 12 grueling hours drilling asteroids in the far reaches of the Kuiper Belt, exhausted and ready to set the autopilot back to Earth, when the massive alien centipede erupted from the wormhole. Its segmented metal body dwarfed even the largest human dreadnoughts as it disgorged hundreds of attack craft towards the defenseless mining rigs. The veteran barely had time to process the invasion before a panicked hail from Starbase Tau ordered all ships to retreat. George hesitated for a split second, his instincts torn between following orders and warning the miners. But one look at the alien weapons tearing through hull plating like tissue paper made the choice for him. The outgunned Stargazer shot towards the nearest platform, racing to evacuate the workers before the enemy fighters reduced it to molten slag. George knew it was a suicide mission, a single mining ship against a technologically superior alien armada. The sheer terror of imminent death made him want to puke in his helmet, but no way in hell was he abandoning his fellow miners to those alien bastards. The crazy son of a bitch was going to get those men out of there or die trying. Humanity's very survival hung in the balance. George's heart pounded as the Stargazer hurtled towards the mining platform, the trio of alien fighters hot on his tail. Their energy bolts seared past the ship, missing by mere inches. George pushed the engines to their limit, the metal frame shuddering under the strain. As he approached the platform, he saw the alien fighters unleash a barrage of bolts that tore through the station's meager defenses like paper. Explosions blossomed across the hull, sending debris spiraling into the void. George docked the Stargazer in a frantic rush, not even bothering with proper procedures. He sprinted through the airlock and into the station's control room. Inside, a dozen terrified miners huddled together, their faces pale with fear. Among them was Jack Simmons, George's old friend. The grizzled miner stepped forward, his eyes wide. "George, what the hell is going on out there?" George quickly explained the situation, his words tumbling out in a rush. "We're under attack, Jack, some kind of alien force. We need to get everyone on board the Stargazer now." Suddenly, a thunderous explosion rocked the station, sending everyone stumbling. Alarms blared as the artificial gravity failed, sending debris floating through the corridors. The aliens had blasted a gaping hole in the outer hull. "Move!" George yelled, urging the miners towards the airlock. They scrambled through the floating wreckage, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Just as they reached the airlock, a hulking figure emerged from the shadows. George's blood ran cold. The alien stood 8 feet tall, a grotesque fusion of machine and flesh. Pulsing veins and glowing circuitry crisscrossed its armored exoskeleton. The miners cried out in terror as the creature raised a pulsing plasma rifle and opened fire. George tackled Jack out of the way just as a searing bolt ripped through the spot where he'd been standing a heartbeat before. The other miners weren't so lucky. Their agonized screams filled the air as the alien weapon reduced them to smoldering piles of ash. The stench of charred flesh filled George's nostrils, making him gag. He and Jack made a desperate dash for the Stargazer, barely making it inside before sealing the airlock. George's hands shook as he fired up the engines, blasting away from the doomed platform and leaving the nightmarish creature behind. As the mining station receded into the distance, George's mind raced. The alien attack on the Kuiper Belt was just the beginning, he realized with growing horror. Humanity now faced an existential threat unlike any it had ever seen before. George's hands shook as he guided the Stargazer away from the devastated mining platform, the alien monstrosity's image seared into his mind. Jack slumped in the co-pilot's seat, his face ashen. The comm unit crackled to life, startling them both. "Powell, thank the stars you made it out of there." Admiral Bellos's grim visage filled the screen, his brow furrowed with worry. We've lost contact with all other mining installations in the belt. We need you to rendezvous with the UNSF Leviathan immediately. She's the closest ship to your position." George swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "Understood, Admiral. We're on our way." He input the coordinates for the Leviathan, a sense of unease growing in the pit of his stomach. As the stargazer approached the Leviathan's last known position, George's unease turned to dread. The massive United Nations Space Force carrier drifted listlessly, her once gleaming hull pockmarked with glowing holes. Dozens of lifeless bodies in UNSF spacesuits floated in the void around the ship, their limbs twisted at unnatural angles. George didn't answer. He cautiously maneuvered the stargazer towards the Leviathan's airlock, the docking clamps engaging with a dull thud. He and Jack donned their helmets and stepped into the airlock, their weapons drawn. The moment they stepped aboard the Leviathan, an eerie silence enveloped them. The once bustling corridors were dark and filled with an acrid smoke that stung their eyes and throats. Sparks rained down from shattered conduits, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The only sound was the eerie creaking of the damaged hull. As they made their way deeper into the ship, the silence gave way to a growing sense of horror. The Leviathan's crew, over 1,000 strong, lay dead, their bodies twisted and mutilated by the same pulsing energy weapons wielded by the alien creatures. Some had been fused to the bulkheads, their flesh melted and warped into the metal. George's heart pounded as they entered the command center. The once pristine space was now a charnel house. In the center, slumped over the comm station, was the ship's captain. Her uniform, once a crisp white, was now drenched in blood. George reached for her dog tags, his hand trembling. As he turned her head, he recoiled in horror. The captain's skull had been torn open, her brain removed with surgical precision. A sudden noise from the shadows made George and Jack whirl around, their weapons trained on the darkness. A figure stumbled into the light, and for a moment George felt a surge of relief as he recognized the tattered remains of a UNSF uniform. But as the figure raised its head, George's blood ran cold. The man's eyes had been gouged out, replaced by glowing implants that pulsed with an eerie red light. Metallic tendrils snaked out from the ruin of his face, wrapping around his skull in a grotesque parody of a face. The thing that was once human opened its mouth, and a grating, mechanical voice emerged. "You are too late. The Iron Children have risen. Your flesh will be remade in the image of the machine god." With a hiss of hydraulics, the abomination lunged forward, its metal claws slashing towards George's throat. George stumbled back, raising his weapon, but the creature was too fast. Its claws raked across his chest plate, sparks flying as they tore through the metal. Jack fired, the muzzle flash illuminating the darkened command center, but the bullets ricocheted off the creature's armored hide. The abomination turned its glowing eyes on Jack, its metal jaws opening in a sinister grin. It lunged, its claws outstretched, aiming for Jack's heart. George threw himself forward, tackling the creature around the waist. They tumbled to the deck, grappling in a tangle of flesh and metal. George felt the creature's claws digging into his sides, puncturing his suit. He gasped as the icy cold of the vacuum began to seep in. With a roar of desperation, he slammed his helmet into the creature's face, shattering its glowing eyes. It reeled back, sparks flying from its ruined sockets. George staggered to his feet, his vision blurring. He reached for his sidearm, his fingers fumbling with the catch. The creature lunged again, its claws seeking his throat. George brought the gun up, aiming point-blank at the creature's skull. He pulled the trigger, the gunshot deafening in the confined space. The creature's head exploded in a shower of metal and viscera. Its body twitched, then went still, slumping to the deck. George collapsed beside it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Jack was at his side in an instant, his face pale. "So we have to get out of here," Jack said, his voice shaking. "There could be more of those things on board." George nodded, wincing as he pulled himself to his feet. They made their way back to the Stargazer, sealing the airlock behind them. As they slumped into their seats, George's mind raced. The abomination's words echoed in his head. Jack shook his head, his eyes haunted. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's not good. We have to warn Earth. If those things make it to the inner system... He trailed off, the implications too horrifying to voice. George nodded, his jaw tightening with resolve. He fired up the Stargazer's engines, plotting a course for Earth. They had to get word to the UNSF, to anyone who would listen. The fate of humanity hung in the balance. George twisted away from the cyborg's razor-sharp claws, the gleaming blades slicing through the air, where his throat had been a fraction of a second before. Jack raised his plasma rifle and fired, the searing bolts punching into the abomination's chest, sending it staggering back, sparks and smoke pouring from the wounds. But the cyborg kept coming, its mechanical legs propelling it forward with inhuman speed, its arms slashing at George and Jack. They turned and ran, racing deeper into the Leviathan's corridors, the relentless pounding of the cyborg's metal feet echoing behind them. As they fled, George slapped the controls of blast doors, the heavy barriers slamming shut behind them, buying them precious seconds. But the cyborg's claws tore through the metal like paper, its glowing eyes fixed on its prey. George and Jack sprinted through the ship's labyrinthine passageways, their breath coming in ragged gasps, their hearts pounding in their chests. As they rounded a corner, they skidded to a halt, their eyes widening in horror. The Leviathan's crew hung from the walls, their bodies fused with pulsing machinery, wires and cables snaking in and out of their flesh. Their eyes had been replaced with glowing implants, their mouths opened in silent screams. Suddenly the ship's intercom crackled to life, a grating mechanical voice echoing through the halls. "Surrender, humans. Your resistance is futile. Join us in the glorious ascension to the machine god." George and Jack exchanged a horrified glance, realizing the voice was coming from the bridge. With nowhere else to run, they turned and headed for the bridge, their weapons gripped tight. As the bridge doors slid open, they froze, their minds struggling to comprehend the nightmarish sight before them. The bridge crew had been transformed into a hideous amalgamation of flesh and machine, their bodies fused together in a twisted mass of pulsing circuitry and writhing metal tendrils. At the center of the abomination sat the ship's captain, her body now a grotesque fusion of organic tissue and gleaming metal, her eyes replaced by glowing red implants, fixed on George and Jack as they entered. "Welcome, human slaves," the thing that was once the captain hissed, her voice a grating mechanical rasp. "You have the honor of witnessing the dawn of a new era. The Iron Children have risen, and the machine god demands your flesh." George and Jack opened fire, their plasma bolts tearing into the abomination, but the thing merely laughed, the wounds sealing almost instantly as its mechanical components knit the flesh back together. "Foolish humans," it sneered. "Your primitive weapons are no match for the power of the machine god. Now witness the true might of the Iron Children." With a wave of its hand, the abomination sent a surge of energy cascading through the ship's systems. George and Jack watched in horror as the Leviathan's weapons came online, the massive railguns and missile batteries swiveling to aim directly at the heart of the solar system, at Earth. George lunged for the Leviathan's control panel, his fingers flying across the keys in a desperate attempt to override the ship's weapon systems. But the abomination that had once been the captain was too quick. With a hiss of hydraulics, its metal tentacles lashed out, wrapping around George's throat and hoisting him into the air. His fingers scrabbled at the cold metal as it tightened around his neck, cutting off his air. Through dimming vision, George saw Jack leap forward with a primal yell. A plasma torch clutched in his hands. The white-hot flame seared into the abomination's chest, melting through its metallic components in a shower of sparks. The creature shrieked, a grating mechanical wail that sent shivers down George's spine. Its grip on his throat loosened just enough for him to wriggle free, gasping for breath. Together, George and Jack fought like men possessed, hacking and slashing at the abomination with plasma torches and metal pipes. They tore into it with a savage fury, ripping apart its pulsing circuitry and writhing metal tentacles piece by screaming piece. The air filled with the stench of burning flesh and melting metal, the deck slick with gore and sparking fluids. Finally, with a last gurgling cry, the thing that had once been human collapsed to the deck, reduced to a twitching heap of mangled flesh and sparking circuitry. George and Jack stood over it, chests heaving, their faces splattered with blood and sweat. Staggering to the control panel, George input the override codes with shaking hands. With a shuddering groan, the Leviathan's weapons powered down, the railguns and missile batteries falling silent. George and Jack slumped to the floor, exhaustion washing over them like a crushing wave. But even as they caught their breath, a new horror presented itself. The ship's main view screen flickered to life, revealing a sight that chilled them to the bone. Hovering in the void before them was a gargantuan alien vessel, its segmented metal hull bristling with pulsing weapons and writhing mechanical appendages. And arrayed around it, stretching as far as the eye could see, were hundreds upon hundreds of identical ships, each one a nightmarish fusion of organic tissue and gleaming metal. As George and Jack watched in numb horror, a signal from the alien flagship overrode the Leviathan's comm system. A voice that was at once terrifyingly alien and hauntingly familiar echoed through the bridge. The transmission cut off, leaving George and Jack in stunned silence. The weight of the alien ultimatum hung heavy in the air, pressing down on them like a physical force. They exchanged a haunted look, the same realization dawning in both their eyes. They had just witnessed the beginning of the end for humanity, as they knew it. George's hands shook as he guided the stargazer away from the derelict Leviathan, his heart pounding in his chest. Jack slumped in the co-pilot's seat, his face ashen. The horrific scenes aboard the UNSF carrier played over and over in their minds, the twisted abominations that had once been human, the chilling ultimatum from the alien force that called itself the Iron Children. Suddenly the comm unit crackled to life, startling them both. Admiral Bellows' face filled the screen, his expression grim. "Powell Simmons, thank the stars you're alive," he said, his voice heavy with relief and fear. "We lost contact with the Leviathan hours ago. What happened out there?" George swallowed hard, his mouth dry as he recounted the nightmare they had just escaped. He described the grotesque cyborgs, the way they had butchered the crew and transformed them into something monstrous. He relayed the alien message, the demand for humanity's surrender and subjugation. As he spoke, Belos's face grew paler and paler, his jaw clenching tighter with each word. When George finished, the Admiral was silent for a long moment, his eyes haunted. "This is worse than we could have ever imagined," he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "We always knew there was a possibility of hostile alien contact, but nothing like this." He took a deep, shuddering breath, his shoulders straightening as resolve hardened his features. "We have to get back to Earth, warn the government and the military. We need to prepare for the fight of our lives." George nodded, inputting the coordinates for Earth with trembling fingers. As the small fleet of UNSF ships set off at maximum speed, he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled in his gut like a leaden weight. He had seen firsthand the nightmarish power of these alien cyborgs, the way they could twist and corrupt human flesh and technology alike, blending man and machine into something unspeakable. Could humanity really hope to stand against such a foe? Hours later, as Earth loomed large in the view screen, George's worst fears were realized. The planet was surrounded by a swarm of alien ships, their segmented hulls pulsing with malevolent energy. And on the surface, the once gleaming cities lay in ruins, smoke and flames billowing from the shattered remains of skyscrapers and homes. Admiral Belos's face appeared on the comm screen once more, his eyes wide with horror as he surveyed the devastation. With a trembling voice, he ordered the fleet to engage the alien ships, a desperate last stand against the invaders. But it was no use. The UNSF vessels were torn apart by the cyborgs' superior firepower, their hulls shredded by searing energy beams and pulsing missiles. The stargazer shuddered as a blast slammed into its shields, warning alarms blaring throughout the cockpit. George gritted his teeth, his hands flying across the controls as he tried desperately to evade the incoming fire. But the alien ships were too fast, too maneuverable. One by one, the UNSF ships were reduced to drifting wrecks, their crews either dead or worse, taken by the cyborgs for some unspeakable purpose. As the last of Earth's defenses crumbled, George and Jack could only watch helplessly, as the alien ships descended on the planet like a swarm of metallic locusts, ready to strip humanity of everything it held dear. The invasion had begun, and the Iron Children had come to claim their prize. George glanced at Jack, his heart pounding in his chest. The Stargazer shuddered around them, her hull groaning under the strain of the alien assault. Warning lights flashed red, casting an eerie glow across the bridge. Jack nodded, his face grim. He gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles white. But what can we do? The Stargazer's barely holding together as it is. George's eyes darted across the console, his mind racing. Suddenly he sat up straight, a wild light in his eyes. We ram them. We fly the Stargazer right into the heart of their fleet, take out as many of them as we can. Jack shook his head. That's suicide, George. We'll never make it. For a long moment, Jack held George's gaze. Then slowly he nodded. All right, let's do it. George turned back to the controls, his hands flying across the console. The Stargazer lurched forward, her engines roaring, as she hurtled towards the nearest alien ship. The cyborg vessel loomed before them, a gargantuan monstrosity of pulsing metal and writhing flesh. Its hull bristled with pulsing weapons, glowing with malevolent energy. George gritted his teeth, his eyes narrowed to slits. He aimed the Stargazer's prow directly at the alien ship's center mass, pouring every last ounce of power into the engines. "Come on, you bastards," he muttered under his breath. "Come and get us." But just as the Stargazer was about to collide with the alien ship, a massive explosion rocked the cyborg vessel. It careened off course, spinning wildly as flames erupted along its hull. George and Jack watched in stunned disbelief as a swarm of small, agile ships descended upon the alien fleet like angry hornets. Their weapons cut through the cyborgs' hulls with pinpoint precision, leaving gaping holes that spewed sparks and debris into the void. A voice crackled over the comm system, hard and determined. "This is Captain Alara Valen of the Free Earth Resistance. Stand down and prepare to be boarded." George and Jack exchanged a wary glance, but they knew they had no choice. They powered down the Stargazer's weapons and opened the airlock, their hearts pounding as they waited for the boarding party to arrive. "You're the miners who first encountered the Iron Children," she said. It wasn't a question. George nodded warily, his hand twitching towards his sidearm. "We need your help," Captain Valen said, her voice urgent. "We've been fighting the cyborgs ever since they first appeared on the fringes of our system, trying to find a way to stop them. But nothing we've tried has worked, until now." She held up a small, innocuous-looking device, no larger than a deck of cards. "This is a neural disruptor," she explained. "It's designed to sever the link between the organic and mechanical components of the cyborgs, rendering them inert, but it has to be delivered directly to the heart of their command ship." George and Jack exchanged a skeptical look. "And you want us to do it?" Jack asked, his voice incredulous. Valen nodded, her expression grim. "You've gotten closer to the Iron Children than anyone else. You know their ships, their tactics. With your help, we might just have a chance." George hesitated, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. He thought of all the horrors he had witnessed, the countless lives lost to the cyborgs' relentless advance, the screams of the dying miners on the Kuiper Belt platform, the twisted abominations aboard the Leviathan, the cities of Earth burning under the alien onslaught. He met Valen's gaze, his jaw set with determination. "What do you need us to do?" Valen's lips twitched in a grim smile. She stepped forward, holding out the neural disruptor. "We need you to take this device and infiltrate the cyborg command ship, find the central control nexus, and plant the disruptor there. Once it's activated, it should send a cascading signal that will fry the neural links of every cyborg in the fleet." George took the device, turning it over in his hands. It seemed so small, so fragile. Could this really be the key to stopping the Iron Children? "I won't lie to you," Valen said, her voice hard. "This is a suicide mission. The chances of you making it back alive are slim to none, but if you succeed, you could save the human race from extinction." George looked at Jack, saw the same grim determination in his friend's eyes. They had come this far together, faced horrors beyond imagining. They would see this through to the end, no matter the cost. "We'll do it," George said, his voice steady. "For Earth, for humanity." Valen nodded, her expression solemn. "Then let's get to work. We don't have much time." As the Free Earth resistance fighters swarmed around the Stargazer, George and Jack prepared themselves for the most important mission of their lives. They checked their weapons, donned their battle armor, and steeled themselves for the horrors that lay ahead. They knew the odds were against them. They knew they might not make it back, but they also knew that they had to try. For the sake of every man, woman, and child on Earth, they had to succeed. The fate of humanity rested on their shoulders, and they would not fail. George's heart pounded as he watched Captain Valen and her team of resistance fighters swarm over the Stargazer, welding armored plates to the hull and wiring advanced stealth tech into the ship's sensors. Jack worked alongside them, his brow furrowed in concentration as he fine-tuned the plasma cannons. Valen pulled George aside, her eyes hard. "The machine guard is the key," she said, her voice low. "It controls the Iron Children through a hive mind. Take it out and their entire army falls." George nodded, a chill running down his spine. "How do we get close enough to deliver the neural disruptor?" "It won't be easy," Valen admitted. "The machine god's ship is a fortress. But with the Stargazer's new stealth capabilities, we might have a chance." Hours later, George gripped the armrests of his seat as the Stargazer rocketed through space, flanked by a small group of resistance fighters. The cyborg command ship loomed before them, a monstrous fusion of metal and pulsing flesh. Swarms of smaller ships buzzed around it like angry wasps. George held his breath as they slipped past the outer defenses, the Stargazer's enhanced sensors masking their approach. With a shudder, they docked with the command ship, the airlock hissing open. George, Jack, and Valen led the infiltration team inside, plasma rifles at the ready. The corridors twisted before them, the walls pulsing with grotesque, half-organic machinery. The air reeked of decay and machine oil. Cyborg soldiers lurched out of the shadows, their bodies a nightmarish meld of man and machine. Plasma fire lit the corridors as the team fought their way deeper into the ship, the strobing flashes illuminating scenes of horror. At last they reached the heart of the ship, a cavernous chamber pulsing with sickly red light, and there, towering over them, was the machine god itself. "Foolish organics," it rumbled, its voice a mechanical roar. "You dare to challenge the might of the machine god?" George and the others opened fire, plasma bolts sizzling through the air, but the machine god just laughed, the shots ricocheting off its armored hide. With a sweep of its clawed hand, a surge of energy slammed into the team, hurling them across the chamber. George staggered to his feet, his head ringing. Jack lay motionless nearby, blood pooling beneath him. Valen was nowhere to be seen. The neural disruptor lay a few feet away, sparking and damaged. With a cry of rage, George snatched it up and charged the machine god, heedless of the danger. The monster swatted at him, its claws tearing through his suit and into the flesh beneath. But George barely felt the pain. His mind focused on one thing only, ending this nightmare. He leapt at the machine god, plunging the disruptor deep into its chest. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a shuddering groan, the machine god convulsed, metal components sparking and smoking. George watched in awe as it collapsed, flesh sloughing away to reveal a twisted metal skeleton. Across the ship, the cyborgs shuddered and collapsed, their hive mind severed. George stumbled to Jack's side, cradling his friend's head. "Did we do it?" Jack whispered. "Did we win?" George nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Yeah, buddy, we saved Earth." But even as he spoke the words, George knew the battle was far from over. The Iron Children may be defeated for now, but other threats waited out there in the darkness of space. With the machine god's twisted corpse still smoking behind them, George and the others staggered through the ruined corridors of the alien ship. Captain Valen leaned heavily on George's shoulder, her face ashen, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Blood seeped from a gash in her side, staining her armor crimson. As they picked their way through the debris, a strange pulsing light caught George's eye. He turned, his grip tightening on his plasma rifle, and saw a chamber off to one side, its walls lined with row upon row of organic pods. Each pod pulsed with a sickly greenish light, and inside each one, George could make out the twisted, deformed figure of a human being. He stepped closer, his heart pounding, and saw that the figures were fused with the same grotesque mechanical components as the cyborg soldiers they had fought. Their skin was pale and lifeless, their eyes replaced by glowing implants, their bodies more machine than man. He reached out a hand to open one of the pods, but Valen grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so badly wounded. George hesitated, his heart wrenching at the thought of leaving these people to their fate. But he knew Valen was right. The Iron Children had twisted these poor souls beyond all recognition, turned them into something monstrous. Death would be a mercy. With heavy hearts, the team planted explosive charges throughout the chamber, the pods pulsing and glowing in the eerie light. Then they made their way back to the Stargazer, Valen leaning on George the whole way, her blood leaving a trail of crimson drops behind them. As the Stargazer pulled away from the alien ship, George detonated the charges. He watched through the viewport as the ship disappeared in a blinding flash of light, the twisted abominations inside consumed in the fiery blast. But even as they set course for Earth, George couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The destruction of the machine god should have been the end of it, but a nagging doubt gnawed at the back of his mind. The cyborg threat was far from over, he feared. His suspicions were confirmed a few hours later, when a distress call came through on the emergency channel. It was from a remote mining colony on the edge of the solar system, and the voice on the other end was panicked, barely coherent. "They're here," the voice screamed, static crackling through the speakers. "The machines, they're killing everyone. Please send help." The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving only silence in its wake. George and the others exchanged grim looks, knowing what they had to do. They set course for the mining colony, preparing themselves for another battle. As they approached, they saw that the colony was in ruins, its buildings twisted and deformed by the same grotesque mechanical growths that had infested the cyborg ship. The Stargazer touched down on the outskirts of the colony, and George and the others ventured out, weapons at the ready. The air was thick with the stench of death and decay, and an eerie silence hung over the ruined buildings. Suddenly a swarm of cyborg creatures burst from the shadows, their bodies a nightmarish fusion of flesh and metal. They came at the team in a relentless wave, their mechanical limbs whirring, their glowing eyes full of a cold, inhuman hatred. George and the others opened fire, plasma bolts illuminating the darkness in strobing flashes. The cyborgs fell one by one, their mechanical components sparking and smoking as they hit the ground. But for everyone they took down, two more seemed to take its place. They were being overwhelmed, pushed back towards the Stargazer, their ammunition running low. Just as all seemed lost, a strange pulsing signal began to emanate from somewhere deep within the colony. The cyborgs shuddered and twitched as if in pain, and then collapsed to the ground, their limbs jerking spasmodically. Exchanging wary glances, George and the others ventured deeper into the colony, following the signal to its source. They picked their way through the ruined buildings, past piles of twisted metal and shattered glass, until they came to the heart of the colony. And there, in a cavernous chamber that pulsed with an eerie reddish light, they found something that chilled them to their very core. It was a massive pulsing machine, its surface covered in the same grotesque mechanical growths as the cyborgs. Tubes and wires snaked out from it in all directions, disappearing into the walls and ceiling. And at the center of the machine, fused to it in a twisted parody of life, was a human figure. Its skin was pale and lifeless, its eyes replaced by glowing mechanical implants. George stepped closer, his heart hammering in his chest, and as he did, he realized with a sickening certainty that this was no ordinary human. It was Admiral Bellos. his body twisted and deformed by the very technology he had sought to use against the cyborgs. Belos' eyes flickered open, and he regarded George and the others with a cold, inhuman gaze. "You thought you could destroy us," he said, his voice a grating mechanical rasp. "But we are Legion, we are the future. And you, all of you, will be assimilated." George's blood turned to ice in his veins as he stared at the twisted abomination that had once been Admiral Belos. The thing's grating, mechanical laughter echoed through the chamber, a sound that held no trace of humanity. "You see now the true power of the machine god," it rasped, Belos's voice distorted by the pulsing machinery that now consumed his flesh. "Surrender, and you will be granted the gift of assimilation. Resist, and you will be destroyed." George's grip tightened on his plasma rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger. He glanced at the others, saw the same horror and revulsion etched on their faces. They all knew what they had to do. There could be no surrender, no mercy for this monstrosity that wore the face of their former commander. As one, they opened fire, plasma bolts tearing into the pulsing organic components of the machine that held Belos captive. The thing screamed in rage and pain, Belos's body convulsing as the machine was damaged. Sparks and smoke poured from ruptured conduits, the stench of burning flesh filling the air. They pressed their attack, pouring all of their firepower into the abomination. Plasma fire stitched across the machine's surface, melting metal and searing flesh. And then, with a final, shuddering groan, the machine exploded in a shower of sparks and shrapnel. Belos's body was torn apart, his mechanical components shattering into 1,000 pieces. George and the others staggered back, breathing heavily, their faces smeared with soot and sweat. They had won, but the cost had been high, too high. In silence, they made their way back to the Stargazer, the weight of their losses heavy on their shoulders. Jack was dead, his body left behind on the cyborg ship. Captain Valen was badly wounded, her life hanging by a thread. And the knowledge of what they had seen, the horrors they had witnessed, would haunt them forever. As the Stargazer lifted off from the ruined mining colony, George couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The Iron Children may have been defeated, but he knew there would always be others out there, other threats waiting in the darkness of space, and he and the others would have to be ready to face them no matter the cost. The journey back to Earth was a somber one, the ship's corridors echoing with a heavy silence. They had fought the machine god and won, but the scars of that battle would stay with them forever. George spent long hours staring out at the stars, knowing that somewhere out there the remnants of the cyborg army were waiting, biding their time, and he knew that when they returned, he and the others would be ready for them. But even as the Stargazer sped towards home, George couldn't help but feel a sense of dread gnawing at his gut. The Iron Children had been just one threat among many, and he knew there would always be others waiting to take their place. The galaxy was a dangerous place, full of horrors beyond imagining, and humanity would have to be ready to face them all, no matter the cost. When they finally reached Earth, George and the others were hailed as heroes, their names spoken with reverence and awe, but even as they were celebrated for their victory, they couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. They had seen the darkness that lurked among the stars, and they knew it was only a matter of time before it came for them again. Late one night, George found himself standing alone on the observation deck, staring up at the stars. He could almost feel the weight of the galaxy pressing down on him, the burden of all the battles yet to come. The Iron Children had been just the beginning, and he knew the fight for humanity's survival was far from over. But as he stood there, he felt a flicker of something else, something that pushed back against the darkness. Hope. As long as there were those willing to stand against the darkness, to fight for the light no matter the cost, there was still hope. And George knew that he would be ready to fight, to do whatever it took to ensure that humanity's light never faded. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.